air on the slopes of Mount Olympus was a cold and thinning pressure that smelled of the high clouds, the ancient stone, and the sharp and electric ozone of the divine. Kratos stood on the massive, moss-covered shoulder of the Titan Gaia as she scaled the vertical cliffs, her every movement a rhythmic and deafening roar of the earth grinding against the mountain. The atmosphere was a chaotic storm of the wind and the white-hot energy of the gods who looked down from the peaks. Kratos felt the vibration of the Titan's heartbeat beneath his feet, a low and steady thud that signaled the beginning of the final war. Around them, other Titans like Oceanus and Perseus pulled themselves up the rock face, their air one of a primordial and heavy hunger that smelled of the fresh soil and the sulfur. From the heights, the gods of Olympus looked down with an air of a sudden and sharp terror. They had ruled for ages, and the air around their marble palaces was thick with the scent of their nectar and their absolute power. Zeus stood at the center of the peak, his voice a low and rhythmic thunder that echoed through the clouds as he commanded his siblings to protect their home. The air turned hot and pressurized as the gods cast themselves from the summit like falling stars. Kratos watched as they descended, their forms blurring into streaks of gold and blue light. The air of the mountain was about to become a battlefield where the weight of the earth met the fire of the heavens, and the air in Kratos' chest was a cold and steady flame of revenge. Poseidon, the god of the sea, was the first to strike, his air a suffocating mist that smelled of the salt spray and the deep ocean rot. He cast himself from the peak, a bolt of blue energy that hit the water at the base of the mountain with a rhythmic and massive explosion. The air in the bay turned into a violent churn as Poseidon rose from the waves, encased in a giant avatar made of the sea and the waterlogged stone. His voice was a rhythmic and crashing sound that made the air in Kratos' lungs feel like a mountain of lead. The gods summoned massive hippocampi, creatures of water and scale that looked like horses of the deep, and they lashed out at the Titans with the force of a tidal wave. The air was filled with the scent of the ozone and the iron scent of the divine energy that held the sea god together. The hippocampi crashed against Gaia's skin, their movements a rhythmic and watery violence that threatened to pull Kratos into the abyss. Kratos moved across the Titan's body with a brutal and focused speed, the air whistling as he used the blades of exile to fend off the water beasts. He felt the spray of the cold sea on his face, but the air in his heart remained steady. He jumped from the mossy ledge to the stone claws of Poseidon's avatar, the air rushing past him as he navigated the shifting water. He drove his blades into the chest of the watery mass, the air ringing with the sound of the metal against the magic. Every strike was a rhythmic and sharp sound that cut through the roar of the ocean, filling the air with the sparks and the golden ichor of the god. Kratos fought his way toward the heart of the avatar, where the physical form of Poseidon was hidden. The air inside the watery shell was stagnant and smelled of the old salt and the dampness of the deep trenches. he encountered the tentacles of the hippocampi, their air one of a cold and mechanical efficiency. Kratos moved with a calculated and quick precision. The air barely stirred as he dodged the strikes of the sea beasts. He used the grapple points on the Titan's body to launch himself at the god, the air whistling as he closed the distance. He grabbed Poseidon and dragged him from the protection of the water walls, the air suddenly turning into a quiet and ringing silence as they landed on a stone ledge near the summit. The confrontation on the ledge was a struggle of pure and raw strength. Poseidon stood his ground, his air one of a quiet and terrifying judgment. But Kratos met him with a roar. The air was filled with the rhythmic sound of the blows, the metal clicking against the divine armor. Kratos delivered a final and devastating strike. The air of the mountain suddenly split by a flash of blue light as the god of the sea was beaten. Kratos grabbed Poseidon by the throat and drove his thumbs into the god's eyes, the air filling with the scent of the salt and the iron scent of the blood. He threw the broken body of the god from the cliff, the air carrying the silence of the death as Poseidon hit the water far below. The death of Poseidon caused the air of the world to shift into a chaotic and violent flood. Without the god to hold the water back, the ocean rose up and swallowed the lands below the mountain, the air filling with the scent of the salt and the screams of the drowning. Kratos stood on the ledge, his breath a steady and heavy rhythm in the quiet. He felt no mercy. The air in his lungs was full of the purpose of his war. He returned to Gaia's back as she reached the very top of Olympus, the air there thin and carrying the scent of the beeswax and the incense of the palace. He stood before Zeus, the air around the king of the gods, carrying the scent of the absolute power and the mountain mist. Zeus looked at Kratos and Gaia with an air of a sudden and sharp anger. He raised his hand, and the air was suddenly split by a bolt of white light that struck the ledge where they stood. The impact was a rhythmic and deafening roar that shook the very foundation of the heavens. Kratos felt himself falling as Gaia's grip failed, the air rushing past him as he plummeted toward the abyss. He tried to use his blades to stay on the Titan's back, but the air was a blur of movement and sound as they both fell away from the peak. Gaia told him that he was a pawn, and that the war of the Titans was not his to lead, her air one of a sudden and sharp betrayal. Kratos fell past the clouds and the layers of the mountain, the air whistling past his ears with the voices of the dead. He landed in the river Styx at the very bottom of the world, the air there a thick and freezing fog that smelled of the stagnant water and the old bone. The souls of the river reached out for him, their touch cold and smelling of the dry dust as they drained the strength from his body. Kratos felt his divine power fatting once more, the air in his lungs becoming a shallow and labored rhythm. He crawled onto the dark banks of the underworld, the air filling with the rhythmic and hollow moaning of the lost. He was alone in the dark, and the air of Olympus was a distant and fatting memory. The first part of his final journey ended as Kratos stood in the gray dust of the realm of Hades. The air was heavy and carried the scent of the sulfur and the metallic tang of the blood. He saw the shimmering green mist of Athena appearing before him, her air one of a quiet and knowing respect. He was at the lowest point of the world, but the air in his heart was still a cold and steady flame of revenge. He checked the chains on his arms, the metal clicking in the silence of the grave, and prepared to climb back toward the light. The war was just beginning, and the heir of the world was waiting for the fall of the next god. The air in the dark reaches of the underworld was a stagnant and heavy pressure that smelled of the dry bone, the old sulfur, and the cold iron of the chains that held the realm together. Kratos stood on the banks of the river Styx, his body feeling the weight of the water that had drained his strength. The atmosphere was a thick gray fog that moved in slow and rhythmic swirls, carrying the hollow moaning of the souls who drifted in the current. He looked at his blades, their glow now a pale and shimmering blue that smelled of the ozone and the cooling ash. The spirit of Athena stood before him, her green mist a quiet contrast to the darkness. She spoke of the flame of Olympus and the secret it held, her voice a steady vibration in the air that told Kratos he must find the source of the gods' power to end their reign. He moved away from the river, the air filling with the scent of the damp stone and the metallic tang of the blood that coated the path. He reached the forge of Hephaestus, where the air was a sudden and intense heat that smelled of the burning coal and the molten bronze. The fallen smith god sat at his anvil, his air one of a quiet and rhythmic sorrow that made the very floor of the cavern tremble with every strike of his hammer. Hephaestus looked at Kratos with eyes that were like cooling embers, his voice a deep and raspy sound in the quiet. He spoke of his daughter, Pandora, and the air in the forge became thick with the scent of the old dust and the bitter regret. Kratos took the path deeper into the cavern, the air whistling as he navigated the narrow ledges of the abyss. The journey through the pits of the dead led Kratos to the palace of Hades, where the air was a suffocating mist that smelled of the rotting meat and the ancient incense. The walls were lined with the massive statues of the queens of the underworld, their stone eyes watching the Spartan with a cold and rhythmic judgment. Kratos moved through the grand hallways, the air ringing with the sound of the metal gears grinding as he solved the mechanical puzzles of the locks. He encountered the three judges of the dead, their air one of a heavy and absolute authority that smelled of the dry papyrus and the old bone. He used the fire of his blades to light the way, the air around the bronze turning hot and smelling of the sulfur. He entered the central arena of the palace, where the air was suddenly split by a rhythmic and deep voice that shook the foundations of the underworld. Hades, the god of the underworld, emerged from the shadows, his air a chaotic storm of the dark energy and the iron scent of the blood. The god was a massive figure clad in spiked armor, his eyes glowing with a violet light that smelled of the funeral pyres. He spoke of the deaths of his brother Poseidon and his wife Persephone, his heir one of a sharp and ancient hatred. The battle was a roar of clashing steel and the rhythmic thud of the soul chains that Hades swung through the air. Kratos moved with a brutal and focused speed, the air whistling as he dodged the strikes of the god. The confrontation was a struggle for the very soul of the Spartan. Hades used his claws to try and tear the spirit from Kratos' body, the air around the touch turning into a freezing and lightless void. Kratos met the pull with a roar, the air in his lungs, a cold and steady flame of defiance. He used the environment of the palace to trap the god, the air filling with the scent of the ozone and the scorched stone. He managed to wrestle the claws of Hades from the hands of the god, the air ringing with a high and rhythmic frequency as the weapon recognized its new master. Kratos felt the dark power flowing into his arms, the air around the purple chains smelling of the old dust, and the absolute silence of the tomb. He used the claws to strike back at the god, the air whistling as the purple energy cut through the shadows. The battle moved across the ceiling and the walls of the chamber, a chaotic dance of the fire and the dark magic. Kratos delivered a final and devastating strike, the air suddenly turning into a quiet and ringing silence as he tore the soul of Hades from his body. The god of the dead fell into the dark waters of the Styx, the air filling with the scent of the salt and the iron scent of the divine blood. As Hades was silenced, the souls of the underworld began to rise in a chaotic and rhythmic swirl, the air turning into a storm of the gray mist. The death of Hades caused the air of the underworld to lose its order. Without the god to guard the gates, the souls of the dead began to wander the halls in a frantic and rhythmic movement. Kratos stood in the center of the palace, his breath a steady and heavy rhythm in the quiet. He felt the weight of the new weapons on his arms, a constant and grounding force against his skin. He had conquered the Lord of the dead, and the air in his lungs was full of the purpose of his war. He moved toward the massive gate that led back to the world of the living, the air there cold, and carrying the scent of the mountain mist and the distant smoke of the war. The second part of his journey ended as Kratos stepped through the portal and emerged onto the lower slopes of Olympus. The air was a chaotic mixture of the rain and the salt spray of the flooded world below. He looked up at the peak, where the lightning of Zeus still flickered in the dark clouds, the air there a pale and shimmering gold. He was no longer in the pits of the earth, and the air of the world was waiting for his next move. He checked the edge of his blades, the metal clicking in the silence of the mountain, and prepared to find the sun god Helios. The war was moving into the light, and the air of Greece was thick with the scent of the falling gods. The air on the slopes of Olympia was a chaotic and shifting pressure that smelled of the wet stone, the smoke of the burning olive groves, and the sharp and electric ozone of the divine war. Kratos emerged from the dark tunnels of the underworld and found himself in the middle of a massive siege where the Titans were tearing the city apart. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of the scorched earth and the iron scent of the blood that ran in the gutters of the marble streets. Above the city, the sun god Helios rode his golden chariot through the clouds, the air around him a blinding and rhythmic pulse of white-hot energy that smelled of the sun and the absolute heat. Kratos looked up at the light, the air in his lungs a steady and focused pulse as he prepared to bring the sun down to the earth. He moved through the ruins of the city, the air whistling as the blades of exile cut through the ranks of the Olympian sentinels. He encountered a massive fire titan, Perseus, who was smashing the walls of the city with a rhythmic and deafening roar. The air around the titan was a suffocating heat that smelled of the molten rock and the sulfur. Kratos used the chaos of the battle to reach a massive ballista on the high ramparts, the air ringing with the sound of the metal gears grinding as he aimed the weapon at the sky. He launched a bolt of iron that struck the golden chariot. The air suddenly split by a flash of yellow light and the rhythmic screaming of the divine horses. Helios tumbled from the sky, a streak of fire that landed in the center of the city square. Kratos reached the square where the sun god lay wounded, the air there hot and smelling of the charred meat and the ozone. Helios was protected by a phalanx of soldiers with shields that reflected the light, their air one of a disciplined and rhythmic defense. Kratos summoned a group of Cyclopes to break the line, the air filling with the sound of the cracking bone and the rhythmic thud of the giant clubs. He fought his way to the god, the air whistling as he dodged the beams of light that Helios fired from his hands. The sun god spoke of the darkness that would consume the world if the light were to fail, his voice a low and desperate vibration in the quiet air. Kratos ignored the plea, the air in his heart a cold and steady flame of revenge. He grabbed Helios by the head, the air in the square turning into a quiet and ringing silence as he prepared for the final strike. Kratos pulled with the strength of a man who had conquered the pits of Hades, the air filling with the sound of the snapping muscle and the rhythmic groan of the divine bone. He tore the head from the shoulders of the god, the air suddenly split by a flash of blinding white light that smelled of the sun and the fresh mountain wind. As Helios was silenced, the sun was extinguished from the sky, leaving the world in a sudden and rhythmic darkness that smelled of the cold ash and the damp soil. Kratos held the head aloft, the eyes of the god still glowing with a pale and shimmering yellow light that cut through the shadows of the ruins. The death of Helios caused the air of the world to lose its warmth. Without the sun, a thick and choking fog began to rise from the earth, the air filling with the scent of the decay and the cold mist. Kratos used the head of the god to light his way through the dark, the air around the light turning clear and smelling of the mountain pine. He moved toward the entrance of the cavern of the Titans, the air there cold and carrying the scent of the ancient stone and the deep earth. He encountered the Titan Perseus once more, the air around the giant hot and carrying the scent of the sulfur. Kratos used the blade of the gods to strike the Titan from the cliff, the air ringing with the sound of the massive body hitting the rocks far below. He reached the path of Eos, a hidden bridge of stone that led toward the upper reaches of the mountain. The air in the passage was stagnant and smelled of the old dust and the copper tang of the blood of the fallen. He had to navigate a series of rhythmic and mechanical puzzles involving the placement of the stone blocks and the tension of the ropes. The air rang with the sound of the iron gears grinding, a sharp and repetitive noise that echoed in the small space. Kratos moved with a calculated and quick precision. The air barely stirred as he dodged the traps of the ancient builders. He felt a sense of grim determination. The air in his lungs was full of the hope of his victory as he moved closer to the heart of the palace. Inside the higher vaults, the air was a suffocating pressure of heat and divine power. The walls were lined with the glowing orange lava that smelled of the sulfur and the molten rock. Kratos encountered a group of statues that came to life, their air one of a silent and eternal watchfulness. He fought with a brutal and focused speed, the air whistling as his blades found the stone hearts of the warriors. He used the head of Helios to reveal hidden passages in the walls, the air there smelling of the ozone and the ancient magic. He was closer to the flame of Olympus than any mortal had ever been, and the air in his lungs was cold and sharp as the wind whipped around him. The third part of his journey ended as he stood on the edge of the chain of balance, a massive iron link that stretched between the world of the living and the heavens. The air there was a constant and rhythmic roar of the wind that smelled of the high clouds and the salt spray of the flooded world. Kratos looked up at the peak, where the lightning of Zeus still flickered in the dark clouds, the air there a pale and shimmering gold. He felt the weight of his chains, a constant and grounding force against his skin. He was the ghost of Sparta, and he was coming to tear the heart out of the mountain. He checked the edge of his blades, the metal clicking in the silence, and prepared for the climb into the light. The air surrounding the chain of balance was a freezing and violent gale that smelled of the high clouds, the ancient iron, and the salt spray from the flooded world far below. Kratos stood at the base of the massive link, the metal feeling like a mountain of cold stone beneath his boots. The atmosphere here was thin and carried the scent of the gray mist that clung to the jagged edges of the peaks. Every few moments, a rhythmic and massive vibration would travel down the chain, a sound like a low and mourning bell that made the very air in Kratos' chest tremble. He looked up toward the summit, where the golden light of the palace was a distant and flickering ghost behind the dark curtains of the storm. He began his ascent, the air whistling past his ears as he used the blades of exile to pull himself from link to link. He encountered the sentinels of the sky, harpies and armored birds whose air was one of a sharp and hollow hunger that smelled of the rotting feathers and the cold bronze. Kratos moved with a brutal and focused speed, the air filling with the rhythmic flapping of the wings and the metallic tang of the blood. He used the head of Helios to blind the creatures that emerged from the fog, the air around the light turning clear and smelling of the mountain pine. He reached a wide stone platform halfway up the mountain, where the air was stagnant and smelled of the old dust and the copper tang of the previous climbers who had failed the journey. As he stepped onto the marble walkway, the air was suddenly split by a high and rhythmic laughter that echoed off the high walls. Hermes, the messenger of the gods, stood on a nearby ledge, his air one of a playful and rhythmic arrogance that smelled of the wine and the fresh ozone. The god moved with a speed that made the air around him a blur of gold and white light, his winged sandals clicking against the stone with a sound like a rapid heartbeat. Hermes mocked Kratos, telling him that the strength of a Spartan was a slow and heavy burden that could never catch the wind. The air in the courtyard turned hot and pressurized as Hermes began to run across the walls, the scent of the burnt rubber and the sharp sweat filling the space. The chase moved through the upper city of Olympus, a place where the air was a suffocating pressure of divine power and the scent of the dried lilies. Kratos followed the streak of gold light, the air rushing past him as he navigated the crumbling bridges and the narrow balconies. He used the catapults and the swinging ropes to close the distance, the air whistling with every jump. Hermes continued to move with a rhythmic and dizzying speed, his voice a constant vibration in the quiet air. Kratos felt the fire of his rage, turning the air in his lungs into a cold and steady flame. He anticipated the god's path, the air around his blades turning hot as he prepared to ground the messenger forever. He cornered Hermes near a massive statue of Athena, the air there still, and carrying the scent of the incense and the mountain mist. Kratos struck with a calculated and quick precision, the air ringing as his blades cut through the divine speed. He tackled the god to the floor, the air suddenly turning into a quiet and ringing silence as Hermes gasped for breath. The messenger spoke of the importance of the gods and the order of the world, his voice a low and desperate vibration. Kratos ignored the words and focused on the winged sandals that glowed with a pale and shimmering light. He used his blades to sever the legs of the god, the air filling with the scent of the golden ichor and the iron scent of the blood. As Hermes was silenced, a thick and rhythmic swarm of the flies emerged from his body, carrying the scent of the plague and the old decay. The air of the world was immediately infected by the sickness, the clouds turning a sickly green and the air filling with the rhythmic buzzing of the insects. Kratos stood in the center of the square, his breath a steady and heavy rhythm as he strapped the boots of Hermes to his own feet. The air around the sandals felt light and carried the scent of the ozone. He felt a new and rapid strength flowing into his legs, the air in his lungs, a steady pulse of the power he had stolen. He was the ghost of Sparta, and he was becoming a storm that the heavens could not contain. used the new speed to run up the side of a massive stone tower, the air whistling past him in a continuous and rhythmic roar. He reached the upper vaults of the flame of Olympus, where the air was a sudden and blinding white light that smelled of the sun and the absolute power. He saw the flame burning in the center of a circular hall, the air around it vibrating with a low and heavy hum. Inside the fire sat the box that held the secret of the gods, the air around the artifact smelling of the ancient magic and the mountain mist. Kratos stood at the edge of the light, the air in his chest feeling like a mountain of ice as he looked at the obstacle that still stood between him and his revenge. The fourth part of his journey ended as he realized the flame was a wall of energy that no god or mortal could touch without being consumed. The air in the hall was a suffocating heat that smelled of the ozone and the fresh sea spray. Kratos looked at the glowing threads that connected the room to the rest of the palace, the air there a chaotic mixture of the gold and the blue light. He knew that to reach the box, he had to find the key that had been hidden since the dawn of the world. He checked the edge of his blades, the metal clicking in the silence of the chamber, and prepared to find the one person who could guide him through the fire. The air in the upper gardens of Olympus was a strange and heavy stillness that smelled of the overripe fruit, the wilted lilies, and the sour scent of the old wine. Kratos stepped onto the emerald grass, the atmosphere feeling thick and stagnant, as if the mountain itself were holding its breath. He found Hera, the queen of the gods, sitting by a fountain where the water moved in a slow and rhythmic trickle. Her air was one of a bitter and drunken despair, her voice a low and raspy vibration that echoed against the marble walls. She mocked Kratos and his quest, the air around her carrying the scent of the peacock feathers and the sharp ozone of her fatting divinity. She looked at the world below, where the plague of Hermes and the flood of Poseidon had turned the air into a gray and suffocating mist, and she laughed a rhythmic and hollow sound. Kratos moved past her, his focus on the massive stone gate that led toward the labyrinth of Daedalus. The air in the gardens became a chaotic storm of the shifting light as Hera summoned her champion, Hercules, to block the path. The air was suddenly split by a rhythmic and deafening roar as the massive demigod stepped into the sunlight. His air, one of a proud and ancient strength that smelled of the lion's skin and the bronze. Hercules spoke of his labors and his desire to finally be the favorite son of Zeus, his voice a steady and powerful vibration in the quiet air. Kratos met the gaze of his brother, the air between them a physical wall of shared history and mutual hatred. The battle began with a rhythmic and massive thud as the two giants collided in the center of the garden. The fight with Hercules was a roar of clashing metal and the rhythmic sound of the stone breaking beneath their feet. Kratos moved with a brutal and focused speed, the air whistling as he avoided the massive Nemean cestus, the lion-headed gauntlets that Hercules wore. The air was filled with the scent of the crushed flowers and the iron scent of the blood that that spilled onto the white marble. Kratos managed to wrestle the gauntlets from the arms of his brother, the air ringing with a high and rhythmic frequency as the heavy bronze recognized a new master. He used the Nemean cestus to deliver a series of final and devastating blows, the air suddenly turning into a quiet and ringing silence as the ground gave way and Hercules fell into the depths of the mountain. Kratos stood in the ruins of the garden, his breath a steady and heavy rhythm as he felt the weight of the lion gauntlets on his hands. The air around the bronze was hot and smelled of the dry grit and the ancient fire. He moved toward Hera, who continued to insult him, and the memory of the daughter he had lost. The air in Kratos' chest turned into a cold and steady flame of fury. He grabbed the goddess by the throat. The air in the garden suddenly split by a sharp and rhythmic crack as he broke her neck. As Hera was silenced, all the plant life in the gardens began to wither and die in a rhythmic and sudden wave of decay. The air filled with the scent of the rotting vegetation and the cold mist, the vibrant green turning into a gray and lifeless ash. To leave the garden, Kratos had to solve a rhythmic and complex puzzle involving the flow of the water and the perspective of the stone statues. The air in the courtyard was stagnant and smelled of the old dust and the copper tang of the dead plants. He used the Nemean cestus to smash the blue crystal barriers that blocked his path, the air ringing with the sound of the shattering glass. He moved with a calculated and quick precision. The air barely stirred as he aligned the platforms to create a path toward the outer walls. He felt the weight of his destiny in the very air he breathed, a constant reminder that the labyrinth was the only place where the key to the flame of Olympus could be found. He reached the edge of the palace, where a massive wooden bridge stretched toward a floating structure of bronze and stone. This was the labyrinth of Daedalus, and the air around it was a freezing and violent gale that smelled of the high clouds and the rusted iron. The structure was a chaotic and rhythmic shifting of the cubes and the gears, a constant and low hum that made the air vibrate with a mechanical energy. Kratos looked at the device, the air in his lungs, a steady and focused pulse. He knew that Pandora was hidden somewhere inside the shifting walls, and that her air was the only thing that could quench the fire of the gods. He checked the grip on his new gauntlets, the metal clicking in the silence of the heights. The fifth part of his journey ended as he stepped onto the first platform of the labyrinth, the air suddenly turning into a quiet and ringing silence. He was closer to the secret of the flame than ever before, and the air in his lungs was full of the hope of his victory. He looked back at the dying gardens of Olympus, the air there a patchwork of the gray mist and the distant gold of the palace. Kratos moved forward into the shadows of the bronze cubes, the air whistling as the gears began to turn. The maze was a trap built by a genius, and the air of the world was waiting for the sound of the first lock being opened. He took a deep breath, the air filling his lungs with the scent of the oil and the ancient bronze. path ahead was a mystery of stone and shadow, but the ghost of Sparta moved with the steady rhythm of a man who would not be stopped. He entered the heart of the machine, and the air of Olympus grew cold as he disappeared into the dark. Air inside the labyrinth was a cold and metallic stillness that smelled of the old oil, the rusted iron, and the dry grit of the mountain stone. Kratos stood in the center of a massive bronze cube, the atmosphere feeling heavy and pressurized as the walls began to shift with a rhythmic and deafening groan. The sound of the gears grinding was a constant and low vibration that made the air in the chamber tremble. He looked at the intricate mechanisms of Daedalus, the air in his lungs, a steady and focused pulse. Every movement of the maze was a calculated and deadly precision, a puzzle of stone and shadow that had been designed to keep the world away from the secret at its heart. Kratos moved forward, the air whistling as the blades of exile glowed with a pale and shimmering blue light in the dimness of the metal halls. He encountered the mechanical guardians of the maze, bronze statues and armored sentinels whose air was one of a cold and repetitive efficiency. Kratos fought with a brutal and relentless energy, the air ringing with the sound of the Nemean cestus smashing against the metal carapaces. He used the lion gauntlets to break through the reinforced gates, the air filling with the scent of the sparks and the scorched bronze. The labyrinth was filled with traps that moved with a rhythmic and lethal speed, spinning blades and spikes that rose from the floor with a sharp and whistling sound. Kratos navigated the shifting rooms, the air barely stirred as he timed his movements to the heartbeat of the machine. He felt the weight of the mountain pressing down on the structure, a constant and grounding force against his skin. He reached a central cell where the air was a sudden and strange peace that smelled of the dried lilies and the fresh mountain pine. Inside sat Pandora, the girl who was the key to the flame of Olympus. Her air was one of a quiet and steady bravery that reminded Kratos of the life he had lost long ago. She looked at him with eyes that were clear and rhythmic with hope, her voice a low and steady vibration in the quiet air. She told him that she was ready to fulfill her purpose and to help him quench the fire of the gods. Kratos felt a flicker of a forgotten emotion, the air in his chest turning into a cold and protective flame. He broke the locks of her cage, the air ringing with the sound of the iron snapping, and led her into the corridors of the maze. The journey out of the labyrinth was a chaotic and rhythmic struggle to stay ahead of the shifting walls. Kratos protected Pandora from the shadows that rose from the floors, the air whistling as his blades cut through the dark energy. He used the boots of Hermes to run across the gaps in the floor, the air rushing past him as he carried the girl to safety. The atmosphere in the labyrinth became thick with the scent of the ozone and the ancient magic as the structure began to rise toward the peak of the mountain. Kratos could feel the vibration of the chain of balance through the walls, a rhythmic and massive thud that signaled their proximity to the palace. He moved with a calculated and quick precision, the air in his lungs, a steady rhythm of the war he was about to finish. They reached the upper vaults where the air was a suffocating pressure of heat and divine power. The walls were lined with the glowing orange lava that smelled of the sulfur and the molten rock. Kratos encountered a group of elite guards who sought to reclaim the girl. Their air, one of a disciplined and rhythmic defense that smelled of the old bronze and the mountain mist. Kratos fought with a relentless and cold energy, the air whistling as he cleared the path for Pandora. He used the head of Helios to reveal the hidden levers that controlled the final elevator. The air, their smelling of the ozone and the ancient magic. He was closer to the flame of Olympus than any mortal had ever been, and the air around him was a blur of movement and sound. As they reached the final platform, the air was suddenly split by a rhythmic and deafening roar as the Titan Kronos appeared in the distance. His massive form, a mountain of stone and flesh that blotted out the sun. The air around the Titan was a physical force, vibrating with the low and heavy thud of his ancient heart. Kronos blamed Kratos for the suffering of the Titans and the death of Gaia, his voice a deep and raspy vibration that made the very air of the labyrinth tremble. Kratos stood at the edge of the cube, his breath a steady and heavy rhythm as he looked at the grandfather of the gods. He knew that to reach the flame, he had to go through the one who had carried the temple on his back for centuries. The confrontation with Kronos was a struggle of pure and raw determination. Kratos moved across the body of the Titan, the air whistling as he avoided the massive fingers that sought to crush him. The air was filled with the scent of the ancient dust and the iron scent of the blood that spilled from the wounds of the giant. Kratos used the blade of Olympus to strike at the heart of the Titan, the air ringing with the sound of the metal against the primordial stone. He moved with a brutal and focused speed. The air barely stirred as he navigated the cliffs of the Titan's skin. Every strike was a rhythmic and sharp sound that echoed across the peaks of Olympus, filling the air with the sparks and the golden ichor of the Ancient One. The sixth part of his journey ended as Kratos stood on the head of the fallen Titan, the air suddenly turning into a quiet and ringing silence. He had defeated the father of the gods, and the air of the mountain was now still and carried the scent of the victory. He looked back at Pandora, who waited at the entrance of the palace, her air one of a quiet and steady hope. The flame of Olympus was just beyond the doors, and the air in Kratos' chest was a cold and steady flame of his own. He checked the edge of his blades, the metal clicking in the silence of the heights, and prepared to enter the presence of the fire that could end the world. The air at the summit of the mountain was a thin and freezing pressure that smelled of the high clouds, the ancient bronze, and the sharp and electric ozone of the divine flame. Kratos stood at the entrance to the upper vaults with Pandora, the atmosphere feeling heavy and pressurized as the labyrinth locked into place against the palace walls. The sound of the gears finally coming to a rhythmic and deep rest was a vibration that shook the very stone beneath their feet. Kratos looked up at the massive iron structures that held the labyrinth in the sky. The air in his lungs, a steady and focused pulse. He saw the architect Daedalus hanging from the chains of his own creation. His air, one of a quiet and hollow madness that smelled of the old parchment and the rusted iron. The architect looked at Kratos with eyes that were cloudy and rhythmic with a fatting hope. His voice, a low and raspy vibration in the quiet air. He spoke of his son Icarus and the labyrinth that had become his own tomb. The air in the chamber filling with the scent of the bitter regret and the ancient dust. Kratos moved past the broken man, the air whistling as he led Pandora toward the central hall, where the flame of Olympus burned with a blinding and rhythmic intensity. The atmosphere here was a suffocating heat that smelled of the sun and the absolute power of the gods. Kratos felt the heat against his skin, a constant and abrasive reminder that the fire was a barrier that no mortal could cross without the key. He reached the circular hall where the flame rose like a pillar of white light, the air around it vibrating with a low and heavy hum. Kratos saw the box of the gods sitting in the center of the fire, the air around the artifact smelling of the mountain mist and the ancient magic. Pandora moved toward the light, her air one of a quiet and steady bravery that made the air in the room feel still. She knew that her existence was tied to the flame, and that to quench the fire, she had to cast herself into the white heat. Kratos felt a rhythmic and sharp hesitation in his heart, the air in his chest turning into a cold and protective flame. He reached out to stop her, the air ringing with the sound of his heavy boots against the marble floor. As he grabbed her arm, the air in the hall was suddenly split by a rhythmic and deafening roar as Zeus descended from the heights. The king of the gods stood before them, his air one of a quiet and terrifying judgment that smelled of the lightning and the cold mountain mist. Zeus looked at Kratos with an air of a sudden and sharp contempt, his voice a low and rhythmic thunder that echoed through the vaults. He spoke of the girl as a tool and a mistake, the air in the room turning hot and pressurized with his anger. Kratos met the gaze of his father, the air between them a physical wall of hatred and the iron scent of the coming blood. The battle began with a sudden and violent flash of white light that shook the palace. The fight in the flame chamber was a roar of clashing steel and the rhythmic thud of the divine energy. Kratos moved with a brutal and focused speed, the air whistling as he used the blades of exile to strike at the god. Zeus countered with the lightning of the heavens, the air turning hot and smelling of the ozone and the scorched stone. They moved through the hall, the air a blur of movement and sound as the fire of the gods pulsed in the background. Kratos felt the weight of the Nemean cestus on his hands, the sound of the impact against the divine shield, a rhythmic and deafening crash. He moved with a cold and relentless energy, the air in his lungs, a steady rhythm of the war that was reaching its peak. Pandora watched the struggle, her air one of a quiet and rhythmic determination. She saw the opening in the fire and moved toward the center of the room, the air around found her skin glowing with a pale and shimmering white light. Kratos saw her move and tried to reach her, but Zeus blocked his path with a rhythmic and powerful blast of energy. The air in the chamber was a chaotic mixture of the smoke and the golden light as the girl prepared to fulfill her destiny. Kratos felt a sense of grim and final desperation, the air in his heart, a storm that even the gods could not contain. He lunged past Zeus, the air whistling as he reached for the girl one last time. The seventh part of his journey ended as the white light of the flame expanded in a sudden and rhythmic wave of energy. The air in the hall was consumed by a blinding flash that smelled of the sun and the fresh sea spray. Kratos was thrown back by the force of the explosion, the air in his lungs becoming a final and whistling sigh as the world turned into a silent and lightless void. He felt the weight of the silence, a constant and grounding force against his skin. He had reached the heart of the mountain, but the cost of the fire was a weight that even the ghost of Sparta could not easily carry. The air of Olympus was still and expectant, waiting for the smoke to clear. He lay on the cold marble floor, his breath a steady and heavy rhythm in the quiet. He looked toward the center of the hall, where the fire had once burned, the air there now clear and smelling of the mountain pine. The box of the gods sat in the middle of the room, the air around it still, and carrying the scent of the ancient magic. Kratos felt a sense of absolute purpose. The air in his lungs was full of the hope of his victory as he moved toward the artifact. He was the man who had broken the world to find the truth, and the air of the world was waiting for the sound of the box being opened. The air in the circular hall was a sudden and hollow silence that smelled of the spent ozone, the cooling marble, and the dry grit of the mountain stone. Kratos stood before Pandora's box, the atmosphere feeling thin and expectant as the last of the divine flames flickered out into a pale and shimmering gray. The massive bronze container sat in the center of the room, its surface carved with the rhythmic and intricate stories of the gods and the titans. Kratos felt the weight of his chains, a constant and grounding force against his skin as he reached out with his scarred hands. The air in his lungs was a steady and focused pulse, the sound of his breathing a rhythmic echo in the quiet of the vaults. He had traveled through the pits of the underworld and the heights of the heavens to reach this moment, and the air of the world seemed to hold its breath with him. He gripped the lid of the box, the metal feeling cold and carrying the scent of the ancient magic and the mountain mist. With a rhythmic and heavy groan of the bronze, he pulled the container open, the air suddenly split by a flash of white light that smelled of the sun and the fresh sea spray. But as the light faded, the air in the hall remained a quiet and empty stillness. Kratos looked into the box and found nothing but the dark and the old dust of the centuries. The air in his chest became a shallow and ragged rhythm of a sudden and sharp realization. The box was empty. The power he had used to kill Ares years ago was gone, and the air of the room was thick with the scent of the bitter irony and the laughter of the gods. Zeus watched from the shadows of the pillars, his air one of a quiet and rhythmic arrogance that smelled of the lightning and the cold ozone. The king of the gods spoke of the futility of the quest and how the air of hope had been lost when the box was first opened. He mocked the Spartan, his voice a steady and powerful vibration that made the very air of the hall feel pressurized. Zeus moved toward the balcony, the air around his white robes glowing with a pale and shimmering gold. He told Kratos that the cycle of the war was over, and that the heir of Olympus would always belong to the immortals. Kratos felt the fire of his rage turning the air in his heart into a cold and steady flame. He did not need the power of a box to finish the war. He had the strength of his own hatred. The battle moved from the hall to the outer platforms of the palace, where the air was a chaotic storm of the wind and the dark clouds. Kratos pursued Zeus through the gardens of the gods, the air whistling as the blades of exile cut through the mist. The atmosphere was a blur of movement and sound as the two giants clashed, the air ringing with the sound of the metal against the divine shield. Kratos used the Nemean cestus to strike at the stone pillars, the air filling with the scent of the dust and the iron scent of the blood. Every blow was a rhythmic and deafening crash that shook the foundations of the mountain. He moved with a brutal and focused speed. The air barely stirred as he dodged the bolts of lightning that Zeus threw from the sky. They reached the heart of the palace, where the air was stagnant and smelled of the old incense and the beeswax of the candles. Kratos drove Zeus back toward the edge of the cliffs, the air there cold, and carrying the scent of the salt spray from the flooded world. The king of the gods summoned his clones, the air in the courtyard filling with the rhythmic and confusing images of the gold and the blue light. Kratos fought with a relentless and cold energy, the air whistling as he cleared the shadows. He felt the weight of his destiny in the very air he breathed, a constant reminder that the end of the age of the gods was near. He delivered a final and devastating strike with the blade of Olympus, the air suddenly turning into a quiet and ringing silence as the weapon pierced the chest of the god. But Zeus was not yet defeated. The air around the god turned into a violent and pressurized storm as he transformed into a spirit of pure and dark energy. The atmosphere in the palace became a suffocating mist that smelled of the funeral pyres and the ancient sulfur. Kratos felt his strength being drained by the touch of the shadows, the air in his lungs becoming a shallow and labored rhythm. He was pulled into the darkness of his own mind, where the air was thick with the scent of the blood and the voices of the family he had lost. He saw the fire of the burning city of Sparta, the air there hot and carrying the scent of the smoke and the bitter regret. He was alone in the dark, and the air of the world was a distant and fading memory. Inside the void, Kratos heard the voice of Pandora, a low and steady vibration in the quiet air. She spoke of the hope that remained at the bottom of the box, a power that could not be taken, but only found within the soul. The air in the darkness began to glow with a pale and shimmering white light that smelled of the mountain pine and the fresh rain. Kratos followed the light, the air in his chest turning into a cold and steady flame of a new purpose. He walked through the memories of his past, the air whistling as he forgave himself for the blood he had spilled. He reached for the light, and the air was suddenly split by a flash of blinding energy that smelled of the sun and the absolute power. The eighth part of his journey ended as Kratos emerged from the shadows, his eyes glowing with a pale and shimmering white light. He stood on the balcony of Olympus, the air around him still, and carrying the scent of the victory. He had found the power of hope, and the air in his lungs was full of the strength to end the war. Zeus looked at him with an air of a sudden and sharp terror, the air between them a physical wall of the coming destruction. Kratos checked the grip on his blades, the metal clicking in the silence of the heights, and prepared for the final strike. The moon was hidden by the clouds, the air still and expectant as the ghost of Sparta prepared to silence the heavens forever. The air on the high precipice of Olympus was a chaotic and violent storm that smelled of the scorched ozone, the iron scent of the blood, and the bitter salt of the rising sea. Kratos stood over Zeus, his body glowing with a pale and shimmering white light that pushed back the shadows of the dark clouds. The atmosphere was so thin and pressurized that every breath was a rhythmic struggle against the weight of the heavens. Zeus lay on the cracked marble, his air one of a sudden and sharp desperation that smelled of the cooling lightning and the old dust. The king of the gods looked at his son, his voice a low and raspy vibration that made the very air in Kratos' chest tremble. The world below was a gray and suffocating mist where the water and the plague had consumed the last of the cities, and the air of the peak was the final sanctuary of the old order. Kratos moved toward the god with a brutal and focused speed, the air whistling as he discarded his blades. This was no longer a battle of the magic or the ancient weapons. It was a struggle of pure and raw strength. He gripped the robes of his father, the air in the courtyard turning into a quiet and ringing silence as he delivered the first blow. The sound of the impact was a rhythmic and deafening thud that echoed across the mountains of Greece. Every strike carried the weight of the years of betrayal and the scent of the family he had lost in the fire. Zeus countered with a burst of dark energy, the air turning hot and smelling of the sulfur. But the white light of hope in Kratos' spirit acted as a cold and steady shield. The fight moved toward the center of the palace, where the massive statues of the gods looked down with an air of a detached and cruel judgment. Kratos used the environment to his advantage, the air ringing with the sound of the marble pillars shattering as he drove Zeus into the stone. The atmosphere was a blur of movement and sound, the scent of the crushed lilies and the old incense filling the hall. Kratos felt a rhythmic and heavy pulse in his hands, a power that did not come from the box, but from the realization the gods were no longer the masters of his fate. He tackled Zeus to the ground. The air suddenly split by a flash of golden light as the god tried one final time to call the lightning from the sky. As the lightning struck, the air in the chamber became a blinding and white-hot pressure that smelled of the burnt ozone and the scorched earth. Kratos did not flinch. The air in his lungs remained a steady and focused rhythm. He grabbed the head of the king of the gods and began a rhythmic and relentless assault. The sound of the bone against the stone, a sharp and repetitive noise in the quiet of the ruins. The air was filled with the scent of the golden ichor and the iron scent of the divine blood that pooled in the cracks of the floor. Kratos felt the life force of the god fatting, the air around Zeus turning into a pale and shimmering gray that smelled of the spent energy and the old bone. The confrontation reached its peak as Kratos drove his hands into the chest of the god, the air suddenly turning into a quiet and ringing silence. He felt the heart of the heavens beating with a rhythmic and shallow thud, a sound that spoke of the end of the age of the immortals. With a final and devastating roar, Kratos silenced the king of the gods. The air in the palace split by a massive explosion of the white and the blue light. As Zeus died, a rhythmic and massive shockwave moved outward from the peak, carrying the scent of the ozone and the fresh sea spray. The clouds above the mountain began to break, the air turning into a pale and shimmering gold as the absolute power of the gods was scattered into the wind. Kratos stood alone in the ruins of the palace, his breath a steady and heavy rhythm in the quiet. He was the only living thing left on the summit of the mountain, and the air in his lungs felt like a mountain of ice. He looked out at the world below, where the smoke of the wars and the mist of the floods were beginning to clear. The air was still and expectant, a vast and open silence that smelled of the new rain and the damp soil. He had killed the father of the gods, and the heir of the world was now a testament to his victory. He felt the weight of the blade of Olympus in his hand, its white light a constant and grounding force against the darkness of the night. The ninth part of his journey ended as the spirit of Athena emerged from the shadows once more, her air one of a quiet and demanding respect. She congratulated Kratos on his victory, but spoke of the need for the power he had found to be returned to her, so she could rule the world with wisdom. The air around the goddess was a cold and rhythmic pressure that smelled of the dried lilies and the ancient papyrus. Kratos looked at her, the air in his chest turning into a cold and steady flame of defiance. He saw the same arrogance in her eyes that had been in the eyes of Zeus, and the air of the palace became thick with the scent of a new and final betrayal. He took a deep breath, the air filling his lungs with the scent of the ancient dust and the promise of a freedom that the gods could never provide. He looked at the blade in his hand, and then at the world that lay broken and waiting at the base of the mountain. The moon was bright over the sea, the air still and carrying the scent of the mountain pine. Kratos knew what he had to do end the cycle forever. He checked the edge of the blade, the metal clicking in the silence, and prepared for the final act of his war. The air on the ruined terrace of Olympus was a cold and hollow stillness that smelled of the spent lightning, the wet marble, and the distant salt of the rising ocean. Kratos stood by the edge of the abyss, the blade of Olympus heavy in his hand, its surface glowing with a pale and shimmering white light. The atmosphere was a thin and pressurized silence that carried the scent of the gray mist and the ancient dust of the fallen palace. Behind him, the spirit of Athena moved through the shadows, her green mist a quiet and rhythmic pulse in the darkness. Her air was one of a sharp and cold authority that smelled of the old parchment and the incense of the temples. She looked at the world below and told Kratos that the power he had found, the hope from the box, belonged to her by right of her wisdom. Kratos turned to face the goddess, his breath a steady and focused rhythm in the quiet. He saw the same hunger for power in her eyes that had driven Zeus to madness. The air between them, a physical wall of a new and final tension. Athena spoke of a new age where she would lead the survivors of the flood. Her voice, a low and steady vibration that made the air in the courtyard feel heavy. She demanded that he return the light of hope to her, her air becoming a pressurized and rhythmic force that smelled of the ozone and the dried lilies. Kratos looked at the blade, and then at the scars on his arms, the air in his chest turning into a cold and protective flame for the world he had broken. He told the goddess that his vengeance was complete, and that the air of the world no longer belonged to the gods. Athena's air turned into a sharp and biting frost as she realized he would not obey, her voice a rhythmic and cold hiss in the silence. She called him a mortal who did not understand the weight of the order she sought to bring. Kratos did not answer with words. Instead, he raised the blade of Olympus, the air whistling as the metal cut through the mist. He did not point the weapon at the goddess, but toward his own chest, the air in the square suddenly turning into a quiet and ringing stillness. He felt the heat of the divine metal against his skin, a constant and grounding force of his final decision. With a rhythmic and powerful thrust, Kratos drove the blade through his own body. The air suddenly split by a flash of blinding white light that smelled of the sun and the fresh sea spray. The power of hope, which had been locked inside his soul, exploded outward in a massive and rhythmic wave of energy. The air of the mountain was consumed by the light as the blue and white sparks moved across the sky, falling like stars toward the flooded lands below. Kratos felt the strength leaving his limbs, the air in his lungs becoming a shallow and labored rhythm. Athena screamed in a rhythmic and frantic rage, her air one of a sudden and sharp despair, as she saw the power being given to the common men instead of her. As the light moved through the atmosphere, the air of the world began to change. The thick and choking fog of the plague began to dissipate, replaced by a cool and fresh breeze that smelled of the mountain pine and the new rain. chaotic storms over the ocean grew still, the air filling with the scent of the damp soil and the promise of the coming spring. Kratos fell to his knees on the cold stone, his blood mixing with the golden ichor of the gods that already stained the floor. The air around him was a peaceful and quiet vibration, the sound of the world breathing again after the long night of the war. He watched as Athena vanished into the shadows, her air a fatting and bitter scent of the old world. He lay on the edge of the cliff, his eyes looking up at the clear sky where the stars were beginning to emerge from the smoke. The air was a thin and freezing pressure, but it was no longer heavy with the judgment of the heavens. Kratos felt the rhythmic and slow pulse of his own heart, a sound that was becoming a distant and hollow echo. He had broken the cycle of the fathers and the sons, and the air of the world was now a vast and open silence where men could write their own stories. He felt a sense of absolute and quiet peace. The air in his spirit was finally free of the fire of his revenge. The 10th part of his journey ended as the sun began to rise over the horizon, the air turning a pale and shimmering gold that smelled of the sea and the dawn. Kratos looked at the world one last time, his breath a final and whistling sigh in the quiet of the heights. He had given everything to end the age of the gods, and the air of Olympus was now a monument to his sacrifice. He closed his eyes as the light of the new world washed over the mountain, the air still and expectant for what would come next. The ghost of Sparta had found his rest, and the silence of the earth was the only witness to his end. But as the camera moved away from the ledge, the air was suddenly split by a rhythmic and low sound of the stone shifting. The body of Kratos was gone, leaving only a trail of blood that led toward the edge of the cliff. The air in the ruins was a chaotic mixture of the mountain mist and the distant sound of the waves. The story of the war was over, but the air of the world carried a new and mysterious secret. The air on the high cliffs of the Aegean was a cold and rhythmic sigh that smelled of the salt spray, the wet stone, and the distant smoke of a world trying to remember how to breathe. Kratos was no longer on the peak of the mountain. The atmosphere around him was a heavy and damp pressure of the shoreline, where the waves crashed against the rocks with a deafening and repetitive roar. He moved with a slow and labored energy, his breath a shallow rhythm that carried the metallic tang of the blood and the scent of the bitter sea. The world he had left behind was a ruin of marble and gold, but here the air was raw and carried the scent of the survival. He looked at the horizon, where the sun was a pale and flickering ghost behind the gray clouds, the air there a shimmering gray that smelled of the cooling ash. He found himself walking through the wreckage of a coastal village that had been swallowed by the floods of Poseidon. The air was stagnant and smelled of the rotting wood, the wet wool, and the mud of the deep earth. There were no voices in the streets, only the rhythmic sound of the wind whistling through the broken shutters and the hollow clatter of the loose tiles. Kratos felt the weight of his scars, the air against his skin, a constant and abrasive reminder of the power he had released into the world. He moved past the remains of a temple, the air there carrying a faint scent of the old incense and the dried lilies. But the gods were gone. The silence was a physical force, a quiet and ringing pressure that told him the age of the heavens had truly ended. As he moved deeper into the wilderness, the air began to change, turning from the salt of the sea to the sharp and electric ozone of a gathering storm. Kratos reached a dense forest where the trees were twisted and old, their air a thick blanket of the damp moss and the mountain pine. He encountered a group of survivors whose air was one of a sharp and primal terror. They looked at the man with the red tattoos and the scarred chest with a quiet and rhythmic judgment. Kratos did not speak. The air in his lungs was a steady and focused pulse as he moved past them. He saw that without the light of the sun and the order of the gods, the world was a place of a new and chaotic darkness that smelled of the wet soil and the cold iron. He spent the nights by a small fire, the air around the flames hot, and carrying the scent of the burning cedar and the dry grit. He looked at his hands, which were no longer stained with the golden ichor of the immortals, but with the gray dust of the earth. The air in the forest was filled with the rhythmic and low hooting of the owls and the rustle of the leaves, a sound that was a strange and peaceful contrast to the roar of the war. Kratos felt a sense of a quiet and heavy exhaustion, the air in his chest becoming a steady rhythm of the rest he had never allowed himself to have. He watched the smoke rise into the night sky, the air there clear and carrying the scent of the stars that he had once tried to pull from the heavens. The journey through the broken lands led him toward the northern borders, where the air began to grow colder and smelled of the coming frost and the dry stone. He reached a mountain pass where the wind was a violent and rhythmic gale that moved the snow in white and blinding swirls. The atmosphere here was thin and carried the scent of the high clouds and the ancient ice. Kratos moved with a brutal and steady determination, the air rushing past him as he climbed the jagged rocks. He felt the cold in his bones, a constant and grounding force that made him feel more alive than the fire of Olympus ever had. He was no longer a god or a pawn. The air in his spirit was a vast and open silence that was waiting for a new purpose. He encountered a spirit of the mountain, a creature of the frost and the old earth whose air was one of a quiet and rhythmic watchfulness. The beast did not attack, but watched from the shadows of the pines, its breath a pale and shimmering mist in the cold air. Kratos realized that the world was full of the old magics that the gods had suppressed, and that the air of the world was now filling with the scent of the primordial and the unknown. He reached a high plateau where the air was still and carried the scent of the mountain mist and the distant pine. He looked back one last time at the south, where the ruins of his home were a dark and fading shadow against the horizon. The 11th part of his journey ended as Kratos stepped into the deep snow of the northern lands. The air was a sudden and strange peace that smelled of the absolute cold and the fresh water of a frozen stream. He was a ghost in a world that was just beginning to wake up, and the air in his lungs was full of the hope of a life that was his own. He looked at the white peaks that stretched toward the sky, the air there a pale and shimmering gold in the morning light. He checked the grip of a simple hunting knife at his belt, the metal clicking in the silence of the frost. He was the man who had ended the world, and now he was the man who would walk into the unknown. He took a deep breath, the air filling his lungs with the scent of the winter, and the promise of a silence that was not the silence of the grave. The path ahead was hidden by the snow and the shadow, but the ghost of Sparta moved with the steady rhythm of a man who was no longer running from his past. He entered the heart of the frozen woods, and the air of Greece grew distant as he disappeared into the white. The air on the high, quiet ledge overlooking the distant ruins of Olympus was a thin and freezing stillness that smelled of the cooling stone, the ancient ash, and the fresh, biting scent of the rising sea. Kratos stood in the center of the broken marble, his breath a slow and rhythmic pulse that was the only sound in the vast and open quiet of the mountain. The atmosphere was no longer heavy with the suffocating pressure of the divine, but felt light and carrying the scent of a world that had finally been cleared of its masters. He looked down at his hands, where the scars of the chains were a constant and grounding reminder of the path he had walked. The air in his lungs was a steady rhythm of reflection, a quiet and deep vibration that moved through the marrow of his bones as he looked back at the destruction and the rebirth he had caused. He thought of the start of the journey, when the air had been thick with the salt spray and the roar of the Titans. He remembered the feeling of the earth grinding against the mountain as Gaia climbed the cliffs, the air then smelling of the primordial soil and the sulfur. The world had been a chaotic storm of the gold and the blue light, a place where the air was a constant and rhythmic scream of the dying gods. He recalled the impact of the blades against the water form of Poseidon, and the sudden, sharp silence that had followed the god's fall. The air of the world had changed in that moment, becoming a violent and rhythmic flood that had washed away the old cities and left the earth smelling of the damp silt and the cold iron. His mind moved to the dark and stagnant pressure of the underworld, where the air had smelled of the dry bone and the old funeral pyres. He remembered the weight of the soul chains of Hades and the rhythmic thud of the heart of the dead. It had been a place of a suffocating and lightless mist, where the air carried the moaning of the millions who had been lost to the war. He reflected on the heat of the forge and the bitter scent of the regret that had filled the air around Hephaestus. Every step through the dark had been a struggle against the density of the past, but the air in his chest had remained a cold and steady flame of a purpose that even the Lord of the dead could not extinguish. He remembered the light of the sun being snuffed out in the city of Olympia, the air there turning from a blinding heat to a sudden and rhythmic cold that smelled of the gray ash. The journey through the labyrinth had been a mechanical and rhythmic nightmare of the oil and the bronze, a place where the air was a constant vibration of the gears and the shifting stone. He thought of Pandora, her air, one of a quiet and steady hope that had been the only clear scent in a world of the rot and the smoke. Her sacrifice had been a rhythmic and sharp crack in the foundations of his rage, a moment where the air of the mountain had turned into a blinding white light that smelled of the fresh rain and the promise of a different future. The air of the final confrontation with Zeus was a chaotic mixture of the lightning and the ozone, a pressurized storm that had nearly consumed the spirit of the Spartan. Kratos remembered the rhythmic sound of the blows in the dark and the realization that the box was empty. He reflected on the moment he had found the light within his own soul, the air then turning into a pale and shimmering white that pushed back the shadows of the old betrayal. The death of the king of the gods had been a rhythmic and massive shockwave that had cleared the sky of the divine judgment, leaving the air of Olympus a vast and open silence, where the scent of the blood was finally replaced by the scent of the mountain pine. He looked at the trail of blood he had left on the stone, the air around the divine metal of the blade of Olympus carrying the scent of the finality. He had released the hope into the world, a rhythmic and glowing wave of energy that had moved across the sea and the forests to find the hearts of the men who remained. The air of the world was now a testament to his sacrifice, a place where the scent of the incense and the temples was fading into the scent of the fresh earth and the new growth. He felt the weight of the silence, a constant and grounding force that told him the cycle of the suns and the fathers was truly over. He was a man who had broken the world to save it from its masters, and the air in his lungs was a quiet and rhythmic peace. The 12th part of his journey was a rhythmic and deep summary of a life lived in the fire. Kratos stood on the edge of the new world, the air turning a pale and shimmering gold as the sun rose over a world without gods. He felt the cold of the wind on his skin, a sharp and refreshing pressure that smelled of the distance and the unknown. He was no longer the ghost of Sparta or the god of war. He was a wanderer in a silent land, and the air of the earth was waiting for his next footstep. He took a deep breath, the air filling his lungs with the scent of the winter and the promise of a life that was not written in the stars. The moon had set, and the air was still and expectant. Kratos checked the grip of his wrap, the leather clicking in the silence of the dawn. He turned his back on the ruins of his past and moved toward the shadows of the northern trees, the air whistling a low and steady note as he disappeared into the mist. The war was a memory, and the air of the world was finally his own.